I was going to ask, so you have this like very experiential way of learning. You really emphasize this like storytelling, which I think is a really interesting way for students to learn, especially, students like freshmen who maybe aren't experienced with like telling their own stories. How do you teach that, right? Like how do you translate that into the classroom? How do you teach good storytelling? How do you really emphasize that it's important to do for your students?
That's a great question. Well, we do a lot of case studies in the class because part of what I need to what I want to do is to teach them some content. What about what about Chinese America? What about Arab America? What about Indian dance in America? What about Native American powwow culture? Right. These are some of the case studies we've done. I always try to use whatever guests and whatever events that are happening. So, for example, we had the wonderful Richmond group called Miramar come in, and that gave me an excuse to do a Latin American unit and use some new resources that I hadn't used yet before, and just to say, like, okay, let's think about Latin music in the United States. Let's think about it in Richmond, right? And then here come these performers, and they come and they did a class session with us, and then they were on the Yule concert series, and we all went to see their concert. We just went to the Chinese Lady, the play that was on Sunday, and we read up on Chinese entertainments in the early in the 19th and 20th centuries, and the kinds of immigrants, visitors that came to be put on display, like the Chinese Lady was, and then later that became performers and magicians and acrobats, and that whole kind of subculture of artistic labor that is so much a part of our culture. It's so much a part of our World's Fairs, our circuses, our nightclub entertainments, our pop culture. And so we kind of try to break that down. And so what made this chapter good? Where was this researcher? What did they do? Oh, it turns out they also danced. They also were engaged in participant observation. They didn't just stand there with a pad of paper and a microphone. They were actually engaged in the very thing they were trying to study. So thinking about positionality, which is really important in ethnomusicology. We try hard not to be that fly on the wall that say, Africans sing this way, or they all like this kind of music, right? That essentialism is something that's, hopefully forbidden forever, but rather to say, this is my experience. I hung out with these people. I hung out with them for an evening, for a month, for a year. Maybe I married into that group and became part of that, So part of that culture or that family. So, understanding where the author is part of good ethnography. So that's a very scholarly thing to teach.
Yeah.
But when you're telling a story, you want to know where the storyteller is, right? You want to, you want to know if they're walking through that war zone or interviewing their own grandfather. One of the things that we listened to that a student did, and this was by no means, the high flyer in the class, just a good student. He interviewed his grandpa about Italian music, right?
Oh.
But his dad translated. So it was just this absolutely, for me, heartwarming interview where, our student is asking the question of his dad. The dad is putting it into Italian. Sometimes the grandpa already understands it. The grandpa's speaking Italian about what is Italian music and what was music like when he came over. And if you're going to understand Italian music, you got to know this and you got to know that. And just the whole thing was just interesting just to hear that conversation go back and forth. So, you could really understand the positionality of the author, who really didn't know much about Italian music and now knows so much more about his grandpa, and that, that kind of generational lineage.
Well, to me, that really speaks to the another thing that's really critical about telling stories, and that's the connection that we create. And that's wonderful that what you seem to be doing naturally is showing students what's going on right now, catch as catch can, there's this thing happening that we can learn from, that we can actually then connect to this thing that we're studying. And it's that connection that creates the story, or at least it creates the essence of the story, right?
Yeah. Mike's got great, he's got good visuals and good sort of like, first do this and then do that and then do that. And I mean, you don't have to do them in a specific order necessarily, but kind of the scaffolding assignment is good. And it's good for me too, because sometimes like I give this assignment, it's like, I don't know why I gave that assignment. I just thought it was a good idea to do that. And then Mike comes up with this scaffolding. It's like, of course I'm scaffolding. We're building towards this other thing, right? So here's the idea. Then comes the proposal. Then comes the, let's talk to your peers about this. And then let's figure out, what do I already have? What do I need to do? Who's my audience? How am I going to get into this? Okay, now what are my examples going to be? What's that cool thing that person said in the interview? How do I get the interview off my phone and onto my computer? How do I chop it up? All these little steps involved. Mike has helped me to just kind of, create a path that...
And you never know where students are going to get stuck. That's the thing. You never know what's going to be a hurdle. There are some hurdles for some students. They might be shy. They might not know how to go and get an interview. That's one skill that they need to work on in their storytelling. There are other students who have that skill, but they might not have the technical skill. They might need to be able to organize their thoughts. It really depends, and that's what I love about the structure of giving students that model of the pieces that they need, because then they can kind of see what they're missing, what they'll gain by getting those skills. So that's been...
One thing, some students are totally ready to go out into the community, or they've got that thing, or they know that Irish dance group, or whatever it is, and others they don't see themselves quite as in it. One thing that's really interesting, and I have a colleague who talks about, her name is Hemesi, Farzaneh Hemesi, and she talks about the ethnotextual analysis, where you're actually kind of mining data that's already out there on the web. And, COVID, right? Everybody put themselves out there. And so there are all these interviews and things like that where you can go and find voices that are talking about the things that you want to talk about, and you can probably get in touch with those people, right? I've had students just like, send somebody a message around the world on Facebook Messenger, and all of a sudden the people are like, this guy was into Taiwanese punk. He said, I'm really into this Taiwanese punk. And I said, well, send him a message on whatever social media, and just see. Of course, they were totally ready to talk to him, and he had these beautiful interviews. Then he translated them into Chinese, and I had another one. He was interested in the winners of the Tiny Desk concert. So what did he do? He got in touch with them and said, how does the Tiny Desk concert change your career? So
what an empowering skill that is, to have, to walk away from your assignment not having ever thought about putting themselves out there, maybe, and then having to do it. And now that's a skill that they're going to take with them.
That's great. That's great, because I've often thought like, if I were at a university in like Boston or Chicago or New Orleans, there'd be all these cool communities. Like we'd have festivals night and day, and here we are in boring old Williamsburg. And what is there? A fife and drum, right? Occasion for the arts, like whatever. And then it's amazing what students can come up with. And then also that now we can expand our worlds in so many ways because of all these technologies that we are just already doing anyway. So that's pretty satisfying.